for all your blessings. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Matthew chapter 22. Today we see the title is The Invitation. And as we see, this is the last week of Jesus' life, sometimes called Holy Week or Passion Week. And it starts off when Jesus comes into comes into Jerusalem on a donkey, and we usually refer to that as a triumphal entry, prophesied in Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9. Jesus comes riding on a colt, on a donkey, and when the king would ride on a donkey, that represented peace, and he came as the Prince of Peace to offer peace. We can have peace with God. We can have peace with others. We can have peace within ourselves, the peace that passeth all understanding. He's offering peace. He's coming on a donkey. When the king rode a white stallion or a black stallion, that meant war, or they rode it after the war as they had victory. They would ride that. We know that Jesus is coming back on a white horse. And when he comes back, we will be with him. Those that get raptured are going to be at the judgment seat of Christ. That's a judgment for rewards. And then there's going to be the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then we're going to ride down to earth with Jesus. He's going to lead his army. We'll be a part of that army. And he's going to be on a white horse. But in the triumphal entry, he's presenting himself as their king, their Messiah, and of course they reject him. And this week of Passion Week, we see that he does that. Also, what we talked about before, he curses the fig tree. The fig tree was the symbol for Israel, and it didn't bear any fruit. There was no converts there because they trusted in a works-based salvation. They believed in Judaism. And true Judaism pointed to Christ. But what they believed, it was heretical. It was a heresy of Judaism. And it was works-based. It was an external righteousness that the scribes, they would interpret the scriptures, and they would write in a book that was called the Mishnah. And they followed that more than they did the Bible. And that was written by the rabbis. And then there was also the Talmud, and that was the oral teaching of the rabbis, and they followed that. And there's some interesting beliefs that they have that they follow today, and you wonder, where did they get that from? Not from the Bible, but from an interpretation from the rabbis, what they said the Bible means. And you have all of these teachings, and some of it's very odd. Then the Pharisees, they had to live out what the scribes wrote down. And so sometimes they'd come up with all kind of loopholes in order for them to be able to meet the demands of what was written, of the law. And they kept all the law, as far as they were concerned, in an external way by following what the scribes would write. And sometimes it was hard because the scribes would write, they would interpret the scriptures in such a way that they got to a point even where you could not even use the restroom in Jerusalem on the Sabbath. And so they had to you couldn't draw water, you couldn't tie a rope this way, you couldn't tie a knot on a rope, but you could, if you were a woman, you could tie your girdle or your certain of your clothing together, or tie it on, or cinch it on with a belt. So they would use that to draw the water because you could tie that. So it was kind of like that. It was crazy. I mean, there's all kind of things. We could go on and on with the different loopholes that they had with the scriptures. But the Pharisees were the ones that they kept an external righteousness where they looked good on the outside. But Jesus saw right through them. And in Jesus' day, you had different religious sects or religious groups. Like you had the Pharisees. You had the Herodians. They were loyal to the Herods. You had the Pharisees that I mentioned. They kept an external. They looked good on the outside. They lived out an external righteousness. Then you had the Sadducees, which were the ones that were in charge of the temple. They were they were the political group, but they had a lot of power. Most of the Sanhedrin were Sadducees, but they didn't believe in anything that was supernatural. They didn't believe in angels. They They didn't believe in the resurrection. They believed only the first 5 books of Moses, of the Bible, first 5 books, the Pentateuch. And so there was these groups that were there. You also had the zealots. They were like the militia group. And you had these, you had the Essenes, who were like the monks. So you had these religious groups that were there, but the ones that Jesus dealt with the most was the Pharisees. And they gave Jesus a hard time. And then also when in the book of Acts, the ones that gave the apostles a hard time were the Sadducees, because they didn't believe in the resurrection, and that's what the apostles were preaching. So in this week, the last week of Jesus' life on earth before he was crucified, we see when he rides in at the triumphal entry. Then we see the cursing of the fig tree. We see him cleansing the temple, turning over the money changers' tables and driving them out. And then he comes the next day and sees that the fig tree had withered. And then he comes and he goes to the temple to teach. And then he's approached. I can imagine that. Jesus is teaching. I mean, the greatest teacher that's ever walked the face of this earth, God himself that became man, and is teaching in the temple, in the court where the Gentiles could come, the court of the Gentiles, and he's approached by the religious leaders, and they start to question him. And so they question him, and then he gives out 3 parables. We see the parable of the 2 sons, the one that he said he wasn't going to listen to his father, but then he repented and he did obey. And then one said he was going to obey, but he did not obey. And so he was saying, the religious leaders, they said they would obey, but they didn't. So then you had the Gentiles. You had those that the Pharisees looked down upon, and they look rough. They look like they're not going to do the will of God, but then they do it. So these parables are all basically Jesus speaking to the religious leaders and saying basically that they're not getting into the kingdom. And if you remember about Matthew is presenting Jesus Christ as the king of the Jews. Really, he's the king of the world. And those that the kingdom was for, specifically, they're not even going to get in, a lot of them. And so he's speaking these parables against them. And you see the parable of the 2 sons. Then you see the wicked vine dressers, where you have the owner of the vineyard, and he sends out his servants to go and collect the harvest, and they're beaten, they're killed, and then last he sends his son, and his son also, they kill him. And of course, the servants that he sent out first represents the prophets, and then he said he's going to send his own son, and that's Jesus. So Jesus is speaking out these parables, and we looked at that. Now this is another parable that he's going to speak to them today. And this is about a wedding. Now, in those days, they didn't have a lot of entertainment like how we have today. Today, we have like an infinite amount of stations. You know, I was looking at our TV. It's a Samsung TV, and they just give you stations. I mean, it comes with the TV. And so you're scrolling up, and there's just endless amount of shows. These are like the older shows, and they were actually better. The one we always watch is Murder, She Wrote. I don't know why, but that's the one that's always on. And then there's other older shows, you know, it's just free. It's endless amount. Then you have, if you pay for like Netflix or something, the one that I recommend you get is Angel, because they have good shows that's not so corrupt. Because TV today is not only is it a waste of time, but it's also there's a lot of carnality and corruption on it, so you got to be careful. But, you know, there's a lot of entertainment. And then we have in the palm of our hands, you can watch all those movies on here. You can scroll through just mindlessly, hour after hour. Now I have this thing. I don't know where it came from, how it got on my phone, but it tells me how long I've been on my phone. It says, so far today. Now, even if I'm listening to something like a sermon it still counts that. You've been on your phone today already for like an hour and a half, it tells you. This is how long you've been on your phone. And I was listening to sermons, but that still counts. They count that. And then it tells you how much you was on like Facebook, Instagram. I mean, you probably know that already, you know. But I never had that before. I don't know. I know I have it now. It's like, I don't want it. I'm trying to delete that. I don't want to know. But we have so much entertainment. We don't have time to really just focus on the Lord. It's good. It's a good practice to say, from this time, I'm not going to look at my phone. Or when you're eating dinner with your family, to not let any, if you're a parent, just say, no phones. You want to interact with. You ever see, you go to a restaurant and you see like a family and then everyone's on their phone, It's like, who are they talking? It's like they don't like each other or something, and then yet, I could say that. I go to a restaurant and, hey, let me see what's going on, man. It's just part of, what our society has become. But in their day, they didn't have none of that. They didn't have TV. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have radios. The only form of communication was verbal or writing letters, and I guess, it's put on, it's probably hard to even communicate that way. But when there was a wedding, that was the event. Because at a wedding, you're going to have some good food. They didn't eat like very nourishing food all the time, like some of us do. Their food was very bland. They were fortunate if they ate every day. And really, probably you only need to eat, I think you really only probably need to eat once a day, I think, when you get to a certain age. But they just didn't have the kind of food that we have and the kind of beverages that we have. And we have it. We could just, anywhere we go pretty much, there's a machine or there's a convenience store. They didn't have that. But when there was a wedding, they knew there was going to be food and drinks for a week. And the groom, he might not have been all that rich, but he would plan this. And if he wasn't that rich, it might take him a long time, but he would prepare for that celebration. And he put everything he had into that. He had two major responsibilities. From the time that he got married, and the way they did their marriages was different from ours. They could be spoken for. Even before they were born, their parents could make arrangements for that. But then once they exchanged the vows, they did not come together physically. They did not consummate the marriage at that time. But they were legally married. That's why Mary and Joseph were legally married. But they did not come together physically. And they did not come together physically until they had the actual wedding celebration. And then but from the time they exchanged the vows, there could be a long time period, is up to a year or more. And in the Galilean culture, which was up north, and this was usually when Jesus spoke because that's where his ministry headquarters was. When he talked about weddings, he's talking about the Galilean style. And the Galilean style wedding was that the only one who knew when the wedding was going to be was the father of the groom. And he would watch his son. And his son had two major responsibilities. He had to get in all the food and everything that they needed for that week celebration. And you know what was like if you go to a luau and they run out of food or they run out of Kahalu'u pig or something, that's kind of an insult. You're thinking, oh, wow, that's embarrassing if they run out of food. You don't want to run out of food. You want people to be taking home food at the end, right? Making plates for their friends or whatever. That's honor, that's a respectful thing. In their culture, it was the wine. You couldn't run out of wine. And when I say wine, I'm not talking about an intoxicating beverage like what you would think. They did have a little bit of alcohol in there to cleanse the beverage so that it wouldn't make people sick because the water there wasn't that clean. And so when they made a beverage, they had it was mixed wine. They had put it was freeze dries. They had put some water in and it created a syrup. And there was a little bit of alcohol content in there with the water, and they would mix it in and made this beverage that was safe to drink. But it wasn't something that would get you drunk normally like what we would think as drinking wine. Now, there was that beverage also, but that wasn't as common as how it is for us in the celebrations that we think in our culture. That's why people automatically think that Jesus got people drunk when at the wedding at Cana when he turned the water into wine. Not so. When Jesus created that wine, there was no need for any alcohol content because he made it just like that. And it was pure. It was purified. It was pure. It didn't need any of that. But they normally, when they had these beverages, they would have that little not intoxicating, but the alcoholic content that was non-intoxicating for them to drink. Now, Timothy didn't drink any wine. Like a Nazarite took vows. When a Nazarite took vows, there was 3 vows that they took upon themselves for just a certain amount of time. One of the vows was they didn't cut their hair. And then one of the vows, they could not touch a dead body or come near a corpse. And then another vow was that they couldn't touch anything that was made from the fruit of the vine, because that way it would abstain from any appearance that they touched something that was alcoholic. Because if you drank grape juice, it looked the same. But so that was the vows they took, so that they would be pure and even look pure in that sense for a certain amount of time. And then when their vow was finished, then they would shave their head. And then they would go to the temple, offer sacrifices, and it had certain ceremonies that they had to conduct. But Timothy, he just didn't ever he was an abstainer all the time from anything from the fruit of the vine. And that's why Paul said to Timothy, drink some wine for your stomach's sake. Because he didn't drink any of that. And so he had that, he got sick to his stomach sometimes because of all the amoebas and parasites or germs that was in their water. He didn't drink the wine. And that's why Paul says to him, and people are saying that Paul's trying to tell people, come on, drink some wine, drink some alcohol. There's a big difference between wine and alcohol. There could be some wine that was alcoholic, but for the most part, it could also be a medicine. It could be like NyQuil, or it could just be a beverage that they would drink at their meals. But anyway, when you go to a wedding, you knew there was going to be some wine for a week. And you knew there was going to be food for a week because their celebrations lasted that long. So to be invited to a wedding, that was the thing. You didn't miss that. You know how today you get invited to a lot of things. You're like, oh, man, another party. Oh, I'm so busy. There's just too many parties. I want to just go home and just scroll through my phone mindlessly. But in those days, it wasn't like that. You were like, I mean, if you weren't invited to the wedding, man, you're a pathetic person. Like, oh, wow, you didn't get invited? Oh, man. No one must like you then. You must not have any friends. But to get invited to a royal wedding, because you know how there's degrees of, you know how when certain people invite you to their weddings or a party, and if it's a certain person, you know that, oh, man, there's going to be, I mean, we're talking prime rib. There's going to be some expensive food. There's going to be, you know, they're going to even probably have the special coffees on the side. There's going to be all these extra things, you know. So you definitely don't want to miss those kind of parties. So this is a royal wedding that we're talking about in this text. So let's look at it. Jesus answered and spake unto them again by parables. In other words, he's telling them a fictitious story, but there's a truth to it that he's trying to get across. Verse 2, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king which made a marriage for his son. So this is a royal wedding. And sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding. Now, in the Galilean-style wedding, there was 2 invitations. First, you're going to have the first invitation, which was more generic, as far as it didn't give the specific time of the wedding, because the father had to watch his son. He had to make sure he had everything ready. And the 2 things he had to do, I mentioned one, he had to get ready for the celebration. He had to have enough food. He had to have enough wine. He had to have enough of everything ready. And also, he had to have the house ready where they were going to live. So the father would watch, and then when he knew the time was coming, when he knew his son had everything ready, everything was set, then he would tell his son, son, go get your bride. And then that's when you specifically knew when the party was going to be. Other than that, you just kind of knew, how's the house coming along? It's getting closer. And that's how it is for us. We know the time is coming closer for Jesus to come back. He said he's coming again for us in John 14. He's coming back. We don't know specifically. The invitation has been given out in a generic sense as to be ready. But then at some point in time, God the Father is going to say to God the Son, go get your bride. We are the bride of Christ. And then the rapture is going to happen. So that's how the culture was. That's why I believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, because it follows that culture. The mid-trib would not follow that. And so the first invitation went out to invite those. It says you're invited to the wedding, but they didn't know exactly when it was. Then when it specifically went out, it was, okay, now's the time. Everything is ready. Come to the party. So there are two invitations. And to the Jews, it was that way. You had John the Baptist who came, who was the forerunner, giving a generic invitation to come. But now it's going to get more specific. And here you had the religious leaders who represented the Jews, who practiced a legalistic form of Judaism, a works-based salvation. And they rejected their Messiah. Here he is. He's coming to Jerusalem on the donkey, which was prophesied, and they rejected him. There was no converts, and then, of course, in a few days, they're going to crucify him, even though they were shouting, Hosanna, save now, but they wanted to be saved from the Romans. That's not who he came to save them from. He came to save them from their sin. So a certain king makes a marriage for his son and sent forth his servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding, and they would not come. In other words, when the first invitation went out, they didn't care. They were just like, what's the point? We don't want to go. You don't want to go to a royal wedding? That's insulting to a king. Kings don't take it very well when someone ignores an invitation like this. It's an insulting thing. In fact, when you have a party for, like you have a baby luau, or you have a party for your son or your daughter who's getting married, it's an honor when you see people that come. It's a blessing. And to them, it was that way. But it was even more extreme for a king, that if you ignored it and didn't come, sometimes that ended your life. They didn't take it very well in their culture, a king. Again, he sent forth other servants, telling them which are bidden, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen, my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready. Come unto the marriage. Now it was the time that the party was, everything was set, everything was ready. He wanted them to come now. And they did not come. But they made light of it, as if it wasn't important, which means the king and his son, they don't mean anything. We're not doing anything that's important. We're just making excuses. And as we were told in Bible school, what an excuse is normally, it's the skin of a reason stuffed with a lie. You know, you could be late to work because you just didn't leave on time. And then there's a little bit of traffic. You would have been late anyway, but now, why are you late? Because of traffic. Well, there might have been traffic, but that's not why we was late. Sometimes it could be, but anyway. They made light of it and went their ways, one to his farm, another to his merchandise, and the remnant took his servants and entreated them spitefully, and he slew them. He says, okay, you guys don't want to come? So that's the illustration that he's sharing with them. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and sent forth his armies, and destroyed those murderers, and burned up their city. And he's talking about the Jews. In other words, There is a marriage that is planned. And God the Father is inviting them to partake of this party, this celebration for his son, their Messiah. And they said, nah, we ain't coming. They didn't believe that he is who he said he is. They hardened their heart, and they didn't believe because they didn't want to believe. And so Jesus is saying, because they rejected their Messiah, because they did what they did, they put him to death. He said that their city is going to be burned. In that he is prophesying the most important, infamous event that the Jews still talk about till this day. And that is the destruction of Jerusalem. The temple was burned to the ground. And when you go to Israel, it is the most important thing that they talk about. It is a day of a mourning, August the 10th. And it is a day that lives in infamy for them, just like how the bombing of Pearl Harbor was a day that lives in infamy for us. And what's interesting is on the same exact day, the Babylonians did the same thing years before. On the same day. Or I guess it was not the 10th, but the 9th of Av. You look that up. All the things that happened on that day. But in AD 70, the Romans, led by Titus Vespasian, he ended up destroying Jerusalem and destroying the Romans destroyed the temple, killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. And the last stand for the Jews was at a place called Masada. And it was hard for the Romans to get to them because it was high elevated. There was only one access point. And so when they would start marching up to get to Masada, and it was a place that Herod built, like a summer palace, well, they were up there. And when the Romans would try to get up there, when the Romans were trying to get to them, they would be throwing things at them, rocks and spears or whatever, and they couldn't get up to where the Jews were. So what they did was they ended up building a ramp on the back side of Masada, and when you go to Israel, you can still see the remains of that ramp that they built. And they used Jewish slaves to do it because they knew that the Jews up there in Masada wouldn't throw the rocks on the fellow Jews. So they were building this ramp, and as they got closer and closer and closer, they knew that the time was short, that the Romans were going to march up there and invade, and then they were going to rape the women, they're going to torture the men and all this stuff. Torture the men and women, rape the women, and all this terrible stuff that they knew was in store for them. So what they did was a mass suicide. And what they did was they drew straws, sort of, and to see who was going to kill who, and then the last people was going to have to kill themselves. And so that was, when you go to Israel, you go to Masada, and they tell you that story. There's two places that if you're a Jew, just about everybody, unless you're of a certain, I think, Arabic background, because they don't want them in the military. Plus, they don't want them to have to be pressured to fight against their own brethren or their own families. But other than that, everybody has to be in the military, and men and women. And two places they take all of them. One is to the Holocaust Museum to show them what happened, and they said never again. And the next place they take them is to Masada, and they show them that these people, they all had to kill themselves. I mean, men, women, children, they all died. And so when the Romans finally got up there, all they found was everybody dead. So that's what happened. Jesus said, you reject your Messiah, you rejected the king, you forfeit the kingdom, and your city will be burned. So there's a guy who was a historian, and he wrote about that time period. He wrote a lot about it, and so I just want to read what he wrote about the burning of the temple. So one of the soldiers went on the Temple Mount, and this is what he wrote. Josephus wrote, "And which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, such that holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was that they kept such a guard upon it." So supposedly a soldier, and they knew that there was gold in the temple, and so they wanted that gold. So they thought, well, let's kind of melt the gold out. Well, one soldier threw in, a branch or a piece of wood that was on fire, and it burned the whole temple down to the ground. And Jesus prophesied that. He said there's not going to be one stone left upon another of the temple. And you go there today, there's just a Temple Mount. And there's a Dome on the Rock on there. And they show you some of the stones that were thrown off on the ground that still sit there till this day. You can see, and they talk about the destruction of Jerusalem. They still talk about that. And that is something that really, really hurt them. But Jesus said, you didn't respond to the invitation. You rejected. And because of that, your city will be burned. And it was AD 70. But when the king heard thereof, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. Then saith he to his servants, the wedding is ready, but they which were bidden, the Jews, were not worthy. Go ye therefore into the highways, and as many as ye shall find, bid to the marriage. So the ones that were invited, they didn't come. So he said, just invite anybody. The food is here. He didn't want it to go to waste. Just go out to the highways and hedges and just bring people to the wedding. Bring them to the party. So they went out. So those, verse 10, so those servants went out into the highways and gathered together all as many as they found, both bad and good, and the wedding was furnished with guests. And because it was last minute, just spur of the moment, they wouldn't have had time possibly to get clothes that was, acceptable at a royal wedding. So they were furnished with clothes from the king. So they were invited. Here's your garments. This is what you wear when you come to the party. And that's how it was, because you couldn't just walk in there dressed any way into a royal wedding. But there was somebody. And when the king came in to see the guests, he saw there a man which had not on a wedding garment. Now, he could have put one on, but he didn't want to put one on. I mean, he wasn't naked. He had clothes on. But he didn't have on the wedding garments that he was supposed to have on. This symbolizes the righteousness of Christ, where we are robed in his righteousness. You cannot make it to heaven without being robed in the robes of righteousness. In other words, his blood has to cover our sin. The Bible says there's none righteous, no, not one. People can be religious. They can go to church. They can look the part. They can come to this church. They can be involved. But that doesn't mean they're saved. It doesn't mean that they have on the robes of righteousness. It talks about that in the book of Revelation. Robed in the robes of righteousness, the white robes. And here you had someone who was at the party. He was there. He was invited. He was a part of it. but he did not have on the wedding garments. He probably felt like, well, my clothes not good enough. I'm just going to wear what I got. And sometimes people feel like that. My good works are not enough. I mean, I've been baptized. I go to church. You know, I'm a member of the choir. I serve in this capacity. I help out with the fundraisers. I give my tithes and my offerings. I'm not going to make it to heaven. And the answer is no, you're not going to make it like that. You have to have your sins forgiven. And there's no way that our sins can be forgiven by works. Even if you stop sinning from this point on, which would be impossible, the sins of the past. But when you receive Jesus Christ, you're saved from the sins past, present, and future. And you put on the robes of righteousness. You're covered by the blood of Christ. Here's us, and you're covered. And then when you stand before God after we die, and if he was to ask us, I'm not sure how it's going to work, but if he was to ask, why should I let you into heaven? Because I'm robed with the righteousness of Christ. I'm covered by his blood. My sins have been forgiven. Come on in. But if someone was to say, well, I went to church. Well, that's good, but that's not the right answer. That's not going to get you in. I've been baptized. You can name anything else. You're not going to get in. So that's what this person, he didn't have on a wedding garment. And he saith unto him, Friend, how camest thou in hither not having a wedding garment? And he was speechless. No excuses. He was offered it. He could have put it on, but just probably felt like, I just want to wear what I want to wear. I want to believe what I want to believe. I don't believe that you have to believe Jesus Christ is the only way. Surely there's got to be another way. No, there's only one way. And he said unto him, Friend, how camest thou hither not having a wedding garment? He was speechless. Then said the king to the servants, Bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen. And he was taken out of the party, but this, of course, pictures someone that is sent to hell, because they don't have on the robes of righteousness. They may have been a good person. They may have done a lot of good things. They may have even had on expensive clothes, but they didn't have on the right clothes. They weren't robed with the righteousness of Christ. For many are called, but few are chosen. We have to receive Christ. You have to make your own personal decision. So that is the invitation. Now you have the inspection. Invitation, inspection. So if you remember that the priests, they were the ones that would have to inspect the lambs to see if they were unblemished. And the lambs would go through some tests to make sure that the lamb was unblemished, that it didn't have, wasn't blind or have some kind of disease or didn't have a broken leg or something. Because when you offered a sacrifice, you had to offer something that was unblemished. God doesn't want our leftovers. He didn't want that, well, I don't need that lamb anyway. I give that one to God. No, you had to give a good one. That's why he wants the first fruits. He wants the first off the top. Pay him first, the tithes and the offerings. And if we do that, then the Lord will help us with the rest of it. But by faith, and even if he doesn't, we say we trust the Lord, and we're going to give him of the first fruits. And that's not just finances. That's of my time, my talents, my treasures. I give it to the Lord because he's worthy. And so it had to be an unblemished animal. And so, being that Jesus is the Lamb of God, he's the Passover lamb. He has to be unblemished. So now he is going to go through some testings. And you have the religious leaders who are the ones conducting these tests in that sense. So now you have inspection. So now they're going to ask him some questions, right? And it's kind of funny because they think they're going to actually trap Jesus. They really did not understand who he is because he has all knowledge. You're not going to be able to trip him up by asking him some stupid questions. You know how they say there is no dumb question? Well, there actually is, because you see some here. And the reason why it was a stupid question, because they weren't necessarily wanting the answer. They were wanting to make Jesus look bad. They were trying to trap him. They were trying to get the crowds against him. So they planned this out. They talked about, hey, what should we ask him? And this is the question they came up with. Verse 15. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. That's what their motive is. And they sent out unto him their disciples with the Herodians. These are the ones that were loyal to the Herods, saying, Master, we know that thou art true. Jesus, seen through that, he's going to call them hypocrites. We know that thou art true and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. We know you're not a respecter of persons. We know that you're not that way. But they're just saying this. Tell us, therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? So they're asking him a question because, and this was concerning what was called the Roman poll tax. This was the tax that the Jews despised the most, that you had to pay a tax just for being a citizen of Rome. Rome was in charge. They were in bondage to Rome. They resented that. And they were always reminded of it by having to pay these taxes, specifically the poll tax. The poll tax you had to pay from the time you were, when a male was from 14 years old to 65, he had to pay this every year. And they had to pay it with a denarius. And they despised it. They felt like they didn't have to pay it. They hated paying it. And on that denarius, the only person that could mint these coins was Caesar. He could give authority for these coins to be made, to be minted. And it would have his image on the coin. So that's why they despised it even more, because they had to give that coin of Caesar. And they hated that. So they're asking Jesus, so is it right for us to pay this denarius to Caesar? And if he says yes, then all the common people, they're going to be upset at that answer. So you see how he's dividing them up? But then if he says, no, we don't pay that, now he's going to be in trouble with the Romans. And they're going to put him to death. So they ask him this question, knowing that no matter what he says, he's in trouble. It's just like, how sometimes attorneys will ask questions where there's no, like, let's say if you're on the stand and an attorney asks you, okay, let me ask you something, sir. How long has it been since you beat your wife? Well, if you say, it's been a while, well, then you're admitting to beating your wife. But they try to ask questions like that to trap you, right? So you can't answer that. You say, I don't, you wouldn't answer in the way it was phrased. They're trying to do that kind of stuff. That's why if you ever talk to an insurance, like if you're trying to make a claim, you got to be real careful. In fact, you probably should have an attorney, because they'll try to make you say things that's going to get it to where they don't have to give you any money at all. I remember talking to when we had something fell on our house or something, a tree or something, and if the tree fell for a certain reason, they had to pay. But if it was for a different reason, they didn't have to pay you. I forget how it was. I don't know if it was like, if it was, how is it? How does they say when God caused it or something? There's a word for it. I forget what it is. No, it's, no. They say that God caused it or something. It's natural reasons. Was that? I forget the phrase they use. But if you tell them it was because of that, then they're not gonna cover it. And I remember them asking me the question, and I didn't know what to say, so I thought, wait, I'm not sure. And so then I talked to somebody, and they were telling me that. And so then I ended up saying the right thing, so they had to pay. I didn't care why it fell. I just wanted them to cover it, you know. But, I mean, sometimes you don't know. It just tree fell. What caused it? I don't know. Maybe it's who knows what. Whatever caused it is for you to have to pay for the damages. That's what it is. So you see these Pharisees and Sadducees and the Herodians. They're asking him these questions. But listen how Jesus answers this. You know, sometimes when we're in a situation we don't know what to say, we need to ask the Lord, Lord, what do you want me to say? How do you want me to answer this question? Because the way he answers it, they weren't too happy. Verse 18. But Jesus perceived their wickedness. By the way, he perceives all wickedness. And said, why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? He knows when someone is a hypocrite. We can never fool Jesus. Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he saith unto him, whose is this image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then said he unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And they're like, whoa. It's not how we were hoping he was going to answer this. And what he's saying is, hey, that Caesar has the image, give Caesar what has his image on it. But what has God's image on it, give it to God. Guess who has God's image on it? Us. You can go back to Genesis. And it says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, the Trinity says, let us make man in our image and after our likeness. We are made in the image of God. That's why human beings are more important than animals. But in this culture nowadays, it seems different. You try and go too close to a seal or a turtle. Try take a pic. Hold one up. Take a picture. Facebook. See what happens real quick. See what happens real quick. You're probably going to jail. You're going to definitely be fined. You'll be in trouble. You mess with these endangered species. Can you imagine if you took an egg from an eagle, a bald eagle? And you know, I guess I don't know if they're endangered or what, or because it's the national bird or what. But I know it's a national bird, but I don't know why it's so protected, if it's because it's that or if it is endangered. Because one time we were in Iowa or somewhere. I think I was with Brother Todd. And there was like 100 trillion bald eagles. No, not that many. But they were just everywhere. So they're not rare. They're all over the place in that part of and I'm sure in a lot of places. But you try to take an egg from a nest and then take a picture on Facebook. I got an eagle egg. Yeah, I'm going to make an omelet. I'm going to make a bald eagle omelet. Do you know? You'll go to jail for many years. But see what happens when these people have abortions. They're celebrated. And they're killing humans made in the image of God because the devil wants to kill what is special to God, especially an innocent baby. It didn't do anything to know anybody. And they're being ripped out, slaughtered, and tortured from their mother's womb. It is crazy. That's how backwards things are. So God says, or Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God's. That's us. We're made in the image of God. He created us. And then he also recreated us through the new birth. He purchased us with his own blood. And so we need to give ourselves to him, like what Jesus says here. When we forgive someone who doesn't deserve it, we reflect Jesus' mercy. And we are conducting ourselves in his image. When we serve without recognition, and we do it in a humble way, we are reflecting Jesus as a servant. When we speak truth with love, we reveal the wisdom of Jesus. And that's what we're supposed to be. We are Christians. We bear his name. We are supposed to be little Christs. It's amazing when a Christian thinks that it's just the right thing to be rude and mean and to be hateful and to be arrogant. Sometimes you see, people that are arguing and saying mean things to people that oppose Christianity. And people are going to, but they're not going to agree until they get converted. So the arguments are basically not doing any justice to who Jesus is and who we represent. Now, Jesus answered how he was supposed to answer, but you always see Jesus doing everything in a meek way because he was very meek. Meek is not weak. It's power under control. That describes my bench press at 24-Hour Fitness. Well, he can only do 135 now. It's power under control. Because if I put too much on there, my body's going to go out of control. It's going to start ripping and tearing, and now I have to have more surgeries. So Jesus said, why tempt me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. They brought unto him a penny, and he saith unto them, whose is this image and superscription? They said unto him, Caesar's. And he said unto them, render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. When they heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. So Jesus passed the tests, that he is unblemished. You cannot find any fault in him. What did Pilate say? I find no fault in him. You know why? There is no fault in him. And so he is being tested. And then now you're going to see the next question they're going to ask, but we're out of time. There's going to be another question they're going to ask. This is a good one. There's a lot to learn about this one. This question is a serious question. You can read it, and then we'll go over it next week. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes?